Second, to enrich themselves by these means with the spoil of the country did not satisfy these destroyers, but they must glut themselves with the blood of the saints upon every pretext that they could catch under any color of law. As upon the account of Bothwell insurrection, many were cruelly executed to the death, some gentlemen and some common countrymen without any legal conviction, by packing bloody juries and assizes most partially for their murdering ends, besides more than can be reckoned that were kept to perish in their imprisonments. And not only for being actually in arms, or any overt act of transgressing their wicked laws, but even for their extorted opinion of things, or because they could not condemn these necessitated risings in arms to be rebellion and a sin against God, which they were forced to declare by terrible menacings of death and torture, they have been condemned to death, making their arbitrary laws to reach the heart, thoughts, and inward sentiments of their mind, as well as outward actions. Whereupon this became a criminal question, robbing many of their lives. Was the rising at Bothwell Bridge rebellion and a sin against God? And this another was the killing of the Bishop of St. Andrew's horrid murder? Which if any answered negatively, or did not answer affirmatively, they were cruelly condemned to death, for which first 5 innocent Christians were executed upon the spot where that murderer fell. Though they declared, and it was unknown, they were as free as the child unborn, and that some of them had never seen a bishop that they knew from another man, and were never in that place of the country where he was killed. And afterwards, this was the constant question that all brought before them were troubled with, which some avouched to be duty, were dismembered alive, their hands struck off and then hanged, and their heads cut off when dead. Third, after Sanjuar declaration, they observed the Jesuit rules more exactly, especially that mentioned above, to load the opinions that are most obnoxious with all odious constructions, and to make it both criminal to declare them, and also criminal to conceal and waive their entrapping questions thereupon. For after Mr. Hall was killed at the Queensferry, and Mr. Cameron with several worthies were slain at Erasmus, and after Mr. Haxton, after declining the authority of his murderers, head and tail, and for being accessory to executing judgment upon the arch-traitor or Archbishop of St. Andrews, though he laid not his hands on him himself, nor was present at the action, but at a distance when it was done, was tortured alive with the cutting off his hands, and when hanged, and before he was dead, ripped up, his heart taken out, and carried about on the point of a knife, and thrown into a fire, and afterwards his body quartered. Then not only such as were with that little handful at Erasmus were cruelly murdered, but others against whom they could charge no matter of fact were questioned if they owned the king's authority, which if any did not answer affirmatively and positively, he was to look for nothing but exquisite torments by terrible kinds of tortures and death besides. And if any declared their judgment that they could not in conscience own such authority as was then exercised, or if they declined to give their thoughts of it as judging thoughts to be under no human jurisdiction, or if they answered with such innocent specifications as these, that they owned all authority in the Lord or for the Lord, or according to the word of God, or all just and lawful authority, these underwent and suffered the capital punishment of treason. And yet both for declining and declaring their extorted answers about this, they were condemned as unsufferable maintainers of principles inconsistent with government. Fourth, but here, as in Egypt, the more they were afflicted, the more they grew. The more that the enemy's rage was increased, the more were the people inflamed to inquire about the grounds of their suffering, seeing rational men and religious Christians die so resolutely upon them. And the more they insisted in this inquisition, the more did the number of witnesses multiply, with a growing increase of undauntedness, so that then shed blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. And as by hearing and seeing them so signally countenanced of the Lord, many were reclaimed from their courses of compliance, so others were daily more and more confirmed in the ways of the Lord, and so strengthened by his grace, that they chose rather to endure all torture and embrace death in its most terrible aspect, than to give the tyrant and his accomplices any acknowledgment, yea, not so much as to say, God save the king, which was offered as the price of their life and test of their acknowledgment, but they would not accept deliverance on these terms, that they might obtain a better resurrection, which so enraged the tigerish truculency of these persecutors, that they spared neither age, sex, nor profession, The tenderness of youth did not move them to any relenting in murdering very boys upon this head, nor the gray hairs of the aged. Neither were women spared, but some were hanged, some drowned, tied to stakes within the sea mark to be devoured gradually with the growing waves, and some of them of a very young, some of an old age. Especially after the murder of the never-to-be-forgotten martyr Mr. Cargill, the multitude of merciless sufferings upon this account cannot be enumerated, which increased far beyond all the former steps after the Lanark Declaration, which was burnt with great solemnity by the magistrates of Edinburgh in their robes, together with the Solemn League and Covenant, which had been burnt before, but when they would more declaredly give new demonstrations of their rage against it, because they confessed and were convinced of its being conformed unto and founded upon that covenant. And because the incorporation of Lanark did not, because they could not, hinder the publishing of it, therefore they were threatened with the loss of their privileges and forced to pay 6,000 merks, upon the back of which the sufferings of poor people that owned the testimony were sadder and sharper and further extended than ever, some being banished for soldiers to Flanders, etc. Some to be sold as slaves in Carolina and other places in America, to empty the filled prisons and to make room for more, which were daily brought in from all quarters, and either kept languishing in their nasty prisons or thieves' holes, in bolts and irons to make them weary of their life, or dispatched as sacrifices and led as dumb sheep to the slaughter, without suffering them to speak their dying words, for beating of drums, or disposed of to masters of ships to be transported to slavery. Fifth, had they satisfied themselves with murdering them out of hand, it would have been more tolerable and reckoned some degree of mercy in comparison of their malice, which, after all their endeavors to murder their souls, by ensnaring officers, enslaving bonds, blasphemous and contradictory oaths, and multiplying captious questions to catch the conscience, or at least vex the spirits of the righteous, whom they could not prevail with to put forth their hands into iniquity, did proceed to invent all exquisite torments more terrible than death. Some at their first apprehending were tortured with fire matches, burning and forever thereafter disabling their hands. Then laid fast and locked up in great irons upon their legs, where they lay many months in the cold of winter without any relaxation. Some were tortured with the boots, squeezing out the marrow of their legs, others with thumbkins, piercing and bruising the bones of their thumbs, and some tormented with both one after another, and besides, kept waking 9 nights together by watchful soldiers, who were sworn not to let the afflicted person sleep all that time. Sixth, all this tyranny had been the more tolerable if they had kept within any bounds of colorable or pretended shadow of legality, or in any consonancy with their own wicked laws or exemplars of any former persecutions. But in an ambition to outdo all the Neros, Domitians, Dioclesians, Duke de Alvis, or Louis le Grands, they scorned all forms as well as justice of law, and set up monstrous monuments of unprecedented illegality and inhumanity. For when, after all their hornings, harassings, burnings, huntings, searchings, chasings, catchings, imprisonments, torturings, banishments, and effusions of blood, yet they could not get the meetings crushed, either in public or private, or the zeal of the poor wanderers quenched, with whom they had interdicted all harbor, supply, comfort, refreshment, converse, or correspondence, and whom they had driven out of their own and all other habitations, in towns, villages, or cottages, to the deserts, mountains, mirrors, and mosses, in whose hags and holes they were forced to make dens and caves to hide themselves, but that they would still meet for the worship of God, either in public, though mostly in the cold winter nights, or in their private fellowships for prayer and conference, and to rescue their brethren and prevent their murder in these extremities, would surprise and take advantage of the soldiers now and then. They then raged beyond all bounds, and not only apprehending many innocent persons, against whom they had nothing to accuse them of, but because they could not satisfy them in their answers, sentenced and executed them, all in one day, and made an act to do so with all, but allowed the bloody soldiers to murder them without either trial or sentence. Especially after the apologetical declaration affixed on the church doors, they acted with an unheard of arbitrariness. For not only did they frame an oath of abjuration, renouncing the same, but pressed it universally upon the pain of death upon all men and women in city and country, and went from house to house, forcing young and old to give their judgment of that declaration, and of the king's authority, etc., to ridicule and reproach, and make a mocking stock of all government, yea, empowered soldiers and common varlets, and impaneled juries, condemn and cause to be put to death innocent recusants, and having stopped all travel and commerce without a pass, signifying they had taken that oath, they gave power to all hostlers and innkeepers to impose oaths upon all passengers, travelers, gentlemen, and countrymen, who were to swear that their pass was not forged. And prisoners that would not take the oath were, according to the foresaid act, condemned, sentenced, and executed, all in one day, and early in the morning, that the people might not be affected with the spectacles of their bloody severities. Yea, spectators also that gathered to see the execution were imposed upon and commanded to give their judgment, whether these men were justly put to death or not. And not only so, but after that, they gave orders and commands to the soldiers to pursue the chase after these wanderers more violently, and shoot and otherwise put them to death, wherever they could apprehend them, whereby many were taken and instantly, most inhumanely, murdered. 11. In the beginning of this killing time, as the country calls it, the first author or authorizer of all these mischiefs, Charles II, was removed by death. Then one would have thought the severity would have stopped, and the Duke of York succeeding in his late proclamation would have made the world believe that it never was his principle, nor will he ever suffer violence to be offered to any man's conscience, nor use force or invincible necessity against any man on the account of his persuasion, smooth words to cover the mischiefs of his former destructions, and the wickedness of his future designs, to which his former celebrated saying, that it would never be well till all the south side of the Forth were made a hunting field, and his acts and actings designed to verify it, since his unhappy succession do give the lie. For immediately upon his mounting the throne, the execution and acts prosecuting the persecution of the poor wanderers were more cruel than ever. First, there were more butchered and slaughtered in the fields without all shadow of law or trial or sentence than all the former tyrants' reign, who were murdered without time given to deliberate upon death, or space to conclude their prayers, but either in the instant when they were praying, shooting them to death, or surprising them in their caves and murdering them there, without any grant of prayer at all. Yea, many of them murdered without taking notice of anything to be laid against them, according to the worst of their own laws, but slain and cut off without pity, when they were found at their labor in the field or traveling upon the road. And such as were prisoners were condemned for refusing to take the oath of abjuration, and to own the authority, and surprised with their execution, not knowing certainly the time when it should be, yea, left in suspense whether it should be or not, as if it had been on design to destroy both their souls and bodies. Yea, Queensberry had the impudence to express his desire of it, when some went to solicit him, being then commissioner, for a reprieval in favors of some of them. He told them they should not have time to prepare for heaven. Hell was too good for them.